Let's have a quick prayer. Holy God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable to you, our rock and our redeemer. Amen. It's not hard to understand why the Noah's Ark story is such a popular children's book. It just lends itself to children's illustrations. All of the animals, every animal of the earth, the giraffes and the elephants and zebras and ostriches, every animal that you can think of that would be fun to draw and fun for a kid to look at, you can put them all into the book. And so it's a great children's book. There's a boat in it. Kids love boats. The boat floats around with the animals in it. It really lends itself to Christian merchandising as well, which is really nice. But if you read too much below the surface of Noah's Ark, it's not a really good children's story. I mean, it's a story of God who got so upset, so angry with humanity and humanity's violence that God decided to wipe everybody out in a huge act of divine violence. The theological implications of that are pretty disturbing, that God, the one who created all of this, then somehow was surprised that this happened and decided to wipe it all away. The other theological implication of the story, which is the one that the Hebrew people emphasized and the one that we as Christians also emphasize, is that at the end of the flood, God had a change of heart. And that is an interesting theological implication as well, that God can change. But you'll find that in different places throughout the Hebrew Bible, that God has a change of heart. God changes and evolves and is in conversation with the people of Israel as their relationship grows together. And that's what happens at the end of the flood, is God says, look, I've seen what this course of action looks like, and I'm never going to do that again, puts the rainbow in the sky. So there's all kinds of richness theologically to this story that, of course, we aren't going to hear much of in children's books. As we read this story, it's important to note that we're not going to read it literally. We're not going to say that there was a literal flood that covered the entire earth. There may have been, historically, some kind of great flood in Mesopotamia, or maybe even in other parts of the world, that was captured in the common cultural memory of humanity and told in these stories. But we're not going to get too nitpicky about how big that flood was or whatnot. The Bible story tells us the exact dimensions of the ark. We're not going to try and fit every animal on earth into those dimensions. See, as I make little boxes and make sure that they're all going to fit. That's not really what the story is about. It's not supposed to be read literally. It's a mythic story. It's a mythic story that it's in our Christian scriptures, inviting us to reflect on what it means to be in relationship with the God, the creator of the universe. As we read the story, you're going to notice that there is some repetition, that things are told and retold in different ways. And that's because Noah's Ark is one of the prime examples in the Old Testament of source theory. And this is a biblical critical theory of how the Old Testament and New Testament came together. That at some point, an editor took one source, which was one version of the story, and took another source, which is another version of the story, and brought them together, and had no problem doing that. And so a lot of us, sometimes today, will take our scientific, logical minds and we'll try and reconcile and say, okay, how could this all be true? And the person who brought these stories together had no interest in doing that. They just, in the creation story, laid them side by side. That's why we have two creation stories. There's God created the world in 7 days, and then there's Genesis 2, where God creates the world differently, where God creates a human being first, and then breathes life into the human being, and then divides the human being into male and female, and creates all the animals. Those two stories can't be reconciled logically, but the editor who brought them together didn't need them to be, because the editor knew that this was different ways of expressing the complexity and the mystery of creation. We get that too in Noah's Ark, but it's done differently. In Noah's Ark, instead of here's one version of the flood, here's another version of the flood, the author weaves the stories together in a way that can be pretty confusing to modern readers. But we'll say, here's one version of part of the story, and then here's the next version of that part of the story, and now we're going to take the story down one more, and then we're going to give the next version of that part of the story. And we're going to go back and forth as we read through all 3 chapters that is the story of Noah's Ark. So, for instance, in the story of Noah's Ark, one source says there was a pair of each animal that were brought into the ark. And then right after that, it says there were 7 pairs of clean animals brought into the ark and 1 pair of clean animals. Again, the editor had no problem with that, weaving those together, saying, look at the story from all these different angles and perspectives. In one version of the story, it rained for 40 days and 40 nights, and the flood was just the result of a really big rainstorm, a really big, long rainstorm. In the other version, it's an undoing of creation, that in Genesis 1, God took the chaotic waters of creation and made a sort of an air bubble for life to exist. And the dome of the sky is a literal physical dome that holds the chaotic waters away from us, keeps us safe, opens up and rains down every so often. And then God pushed the waters down and pushed them under the ground and made land for us. And God is actively holding back the ocean to give us land to live on. So that's Genesis 1. In the Noah's Ark version of that same source, God undoes all that. God takes away what was holding back the waters, and they come back onto the land, and God opens the windows of the dome, and the chaotic cosmic waters come down. And again, those 2 versions lived side by side and braided together in this story that we have today. Which brings us to what we read this morning, and we see why it seems kind of repetitive. That there is, Noah thought that the flood was receding, and then Noah thought that the flood was receding, and then the flood receded, and then Noah thought the flood was receding, and then God, Noah sent out a raven, and then a dove, and then should I go out of the ark? And over, and it becomes this complicated story that can't be contained logically, and it gives us the ability then to, those diagrams of a car engine? They're either called expanded or exploded versions, and it takes the engine and just takes every part and rips it apart into this big thing. That's kind of what having 2 versions of Noah's Ark is doing. It's saying, here's the flood story. We're going to pull it apart like this and see how all the parts are working together. As we come to this story about Noah's discernment of when the flood was over, I think it's that expanded, multifaceted view that can help us dig into the story in a way that's applicable to our lives. And so that we can then also ask the question, how do we know when one part of our life is coming to an end so that something new can emerge? How do we know when something is getting ready to die or to end so that there can be a new birth or new growth that comes after that? I think the story of Noah's Ark gives us a lot of different ways to get a handle on what it means to discern God's will through uncertain times in our life. Let me give you some examples first of the things that can come to an end so that new things can be born. A job. We can come to the end of a job. We've worked with one employer for a certain amount of time. It's been a good experience, and we come and we say, you know what? I think it's time to move on, but I can't quite tell for sure. Retirement, along the same vein. I've done this career my whole life. Is it time for that to come to an end so this other phase of retirement can be born? Grief. And not to say that grief ever necessarily ends, but phases, times of grief, intensities of grief can come to an end. And so when we've lost someone we love, we can feel that grief intensely. And then there comes a time when we have to ask ourselves, is it time to move on? I'm never going to stop missing that person or grieving them, but is it time then to put the grieving down and take on a new step in my life? A relationship can come to an end. Sadly, marriages can come to an end. Intimate partner relationships can come to an end. We don't always know exactly when or why that's happening, and it's very hard to discern sometimes when it is. Changes of identity. Changes of, I've been this person all my life, and it's time for me to be who I truly am. The LGBT community gave us the wonderful metaphor of coming out of the closet, this time of taking off our masks, the things that society has told us we have to be. And now we've come to a point in our lives, and it comes time to say, is it time for me to step out of this closet? Is it time for me to take this mask and lay it down and be the person God created me to be? Volunteer positions at a church. Here we are at the beginning of the church year. We're looking for lots of people to fill volunteer positions, but maybe it's time to also let something go. And maybe time that you've done something for a long time and you're like, this isn't filling me anymore. And maybe that's because you've grown and there's something else that God is calling you to do. A lot of these are kind of adult kinds of things, but they can also be true for children. Children have the advantage of in school, summer's over. Now it's time for school. And then school's over, and now I'm going to another grade. And they're told when something comes to an end and when something new can be born. But children also maybe have played an instrument all their life. They were very little, and they're now in high school, and maybe they're discerning, do I really want to keep playing this instrument? Is this going to be my life? My daughter, for sports, she played soccer since she was a very little girl, and then in middle school started playing softball and played both for a while and realized that she wanted to be a softball player. That's what she wanted to do. And if she was going to really commit to that, she had to let go of soccer. And that was a hard decision for her, but she did. So we all at every age have these times where we have to discern when something comes to an end and when something new is ready to be born. When we look at the Noah's Ark story, I'm not going to give you like 3 easy ways to know what God is calling you to do. It's going to be more like, here are different ways that Noah tried to discern God's will. And all of those are going to be part of any discernment process as we seek to find God's will in our own lives. For Noah, first, there was a big sign. The ark came to rest on the mountains. Now, we might imagine this, and the way it's kind of told in the book is like the waters receded and it gently laid the ark down on the mountain. But anybody who's done any sailing or been in a boat knows that when you run aground, that's not how it goes. It's not gentle. The thing that was moving underneath you has stopped moving, but you keep going and you go flying onto your face. That's a good time to think, maybe it's time for something new. I've just fallen on my face. Maybe in a job, maybe in a relationship. Not saying every time you fail, you quit, but is this a sign that there's some time for something new when some kind of disaster, something falls apart, when things fall apart? The next thing that Noah does is he sends out the raven. And I love the raven so much. I love the raven partly because there's so much resonance with like Native American myth, where the raven could be a character, and probably throughout the world that birds are mythical characters. This raven in this story is a mythical bird. This raven dries up the waters of the flood. That's what it says that the raven does. Now, it doesn't say the raven expanded into this humongous bird, but that must be what happened. It wasn't like a little raven flew around and dried up the flood. It must have emerged into this sort of massive raven and whoosh, like these big wings pushing the waters of the flood back. What that says to me is that there can be times in our discernment process that are very active. That we're going to go out into the world and we're going to try something new. We're going to do some research to see if it's ready for us to make a change. We're going to apply for that new job. We're going to experiment with some new things. The raven is a sign or a symbol of that active phase of the discernment process, where we're not just going to sit and wait, see what happens. We're going to go and explore. The dove is still active, but there is for Noah more of a waiting with the dove. Noah sends the dove out, and at first the dove goes away, and it doesn't tell us how long the dove was gone. Who knows how long that dove was out there flying around? It could have been a month. Noah's like, I wonder if the dove's coming back. Maybe it drowned, maybe it found land and is not coming back. Maybe it got eaten by a shark, it's got too close to the water. Arr. How did the sharks get off the hook in this story anyway? Do you ever wonder about that? All the fish. God was so angry and killed all the land animals. None of the fish apparently had any problem with the flood. Sharks are very violent creatures. That was the problem. Anyway, so Noah's like, what's going on? When is this stuff coming back? And that's very true for discernment, isn't it? Where we're like, I don't know. I'm waiting, I'm listening. Remember, the dove can also be a symbol for the Holy Spirit in the Christian tradition. I'm waiting for the Spirit to kind of give me some guidance. I don't know what's happening. So finally the dove comes back, and who knows what it means? The dove didn't have anything. Did the dove find land and then come back and not say anything? We don't know. So Noah waits 7 days. Patience is a good part of this story. Sends the dove out, and within 1 day comes back with an olive leaf, which still requires some interpretation. What does this mean? An olive leaf. Weren't all the plants destroyed with all the animals of the earth? How is there suddenly an olive tree growing all of a sudden? Or is this just a leaf that was floating around? There's still lots of questions. Takes the dove in, 7 more days, sends the dove out, and then the dove doesn't come back. So still there's all this ambiguity and uncertainty in the process of his discernment. The last thing that this story contains but doesn't contain, we have to assume it was happening because it says Noah was a righteous man, so we have to assume that he wasn't doing this on his own, that he wasn't going through this discernment process by himself. Just me and God are going to figure this out. He had a bunch of other people in that ark with him. He had his wife, he had his sons, he had his son's wife. If he was a righteous man, he was in conversation with them about his discernment process. He was, in other words, talking to people that he knew and loved and trusted. And they were helping him say, okay, so we've got the raven's done this, the dove's done this, we have the olive leaf, the dove's gone. They were helping him work out what God was calling him to do. And that's very good advice for all of us. When we are seeking God's will, we need to be talking to people we know and love and trust. The last thing that happens is something that we shouldn't expect is going to happen to us. God speaks to Noah and says, get out of the boat. That's unlikely to happen in any discernment process, and I actually don't know if it happened in this one either. Sometimes when God speaks to a character in the Bible, it may be that what's happening is the author of the story is summarizing what happened during the discernment process and the conclusions that came, the conclusions that happened, you know? So it's a literary tool for saying, okay, we went through all this, and with the gift of hindsight, we can look back several years and say, it was clear now that it was time for Noah to leave the ark. And isn't that true for our discernment processes as well? That we are sometimes feeling around in the dark, trying to figure out what's God's will for us, what's the right thing to do next, and we just take step after step after step, and it isn't until a few years later when we look back and we say, oh, yeah, God was leading my path through that whole way, and I did everything that I was intended to do, I just didn't always know exactly what was happening. I think that's what happens when it says God spoke to Noah. So don't wait for the voice of God to come from heaven and say, it's time to quit your job. Or, you know, that's not going to happen. The discernment process that we are called to is laid out for us by Noah. It's a process of paying attention to those big changes, those big signs that wake us up and say it's time for something else to happen. It's about being active, researching, trying new things, getting out there and seeing what could be different, what could be new in our lives. It's about waiting, listening, pondering, paying attention to what the Spirit is doing. And it's got to be about talking to people. We've got to then talk to the people we love and talk to the people we trust and say, can you help me see what God is calling me to do? And if we do all those things, we may not know in the moment that we've followed God's will. But we will know in a few years as we look back and realize that God was speaking to us the whole time. Amen.